think it should come as a major surprise.
Yeah.
When the budget took place earlier this year, we knew at the time that it was based on a number of very delicate assumptions, and there were a number of risks involved, one of which has been mentioned. The private sector wage bill is going to be higher than initially budgeted. Secondly, and this is one of those chicken and egg situations, because of low economic growth, the tax base is not really growing all that much.
Yeah.
And the tax base, if the tax base doesn't grow, we can't get high economic growth. So fiscal space is very limited. All the other external, internal factors were on the cards, I'm afraid. The IMF's forecast for economic growth for the country for this year, 0.1%, is on the low side. But so too are most other forecasts, frankly. It's really only Treasury which is somewhat at a higher initial estimate of 0.9%. So 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, not a major surprise, really.
Yeah. As you mentioned, the IMF pegging economic growth at a weak 0.1%. What would then have to happen for this to turn around going forward? I was listening to the package earlier, and they were also mentioning things like, more rate hikes. And I mean, for the average South African, the consumer, that looks more like a punishment. And perhaps maybe you can expand and talk to us about, why this is possibly a solution when we're sitting there saying, but, we can no longer cope with these rate hikes.
Sure. Yeah, it is, again, it's one of those unfortunate situations where we are probably on the brink of, if not already, in a situation called stagflation.
Yeah.
The worst of both worlds, very low economic growth and high inflation. You normally get either one or the other,
right,
which makes life for policymakers virtually impossible. You can't win. Now, the Reserve Bank, or a central bank like our Reserve Bank, has a very clear mandate, and that is to keep inflation under control, which for the time being is deemed to be between 3% and 6%. In fact, it's a constitutional mandate, so they really haven't got much of a choice when it comes to interest rate decisions, as long as inflation is somewhat above that 6% level. And we can also argue that certainly it's awfully painful in the short term, high interest rates in the current environment, but in the longer term, it ought to create a more stable macro financial environment for future sustained economic growth.
Yeah.
So it's one of those issues of you need, excuse the cliche, short-term pain for longer-term gain.
Yeah. Prof, I was also, looking at some of the solutions that have been presented to our South African government. One of them being that South African government is urged to better rein in on spending. And, what I thought about there was, what is the government spending on when so much is actually broken? So, when we're saying that, we're possibly overspending, what are we possibly overspending on?
Well, these terms are always very relative, but we do have to admit that when we look at government spending, there's a preponderance towards what one could call current spending. So, for instance, for roughly every 100 rands worth of tax that you and I pay, 70 rand goes towards civil servant wages, our social grant system, and then paying interest on previously incurred debt. That leaves only 30 rand for every 100 rand that you and I pay for important things such as, take your pick, infrastructure, Eskom, transport, education, and healthcare, and the like. So it's about the structure, I think, of our spending. We're spending too much and therefore borrowing money to also help finance civil servant salaries, social grants, etc. Now, cutting back on any one of these things is going to be painful for somebody. Obviously, trying to freeze or slow down or curb civil servant salaries is painful to a huge number of people. The grant system, which was expanded, of course, as a result of COVID and has been extended to at least to next year, taking that away will cause hardship for many families. The interest we have to pay, we have no choice in the matter. So that is one of the reasons why it's so important to at least stabilize that government debt, that public debt.
Yeah.
So at least we can start curbing that kind of spending.
Yeah, and where do you see, a future economic growth? I know it's a difficult one to assess because we don't know, what we'll be, battling with. I mean, a couple of years ago, we didn't know, for instance, that we'd be having to deal with a pandemic, and we don't know what's next. But, what are your ideas or projections of when it comes to future economic growth?
Well, I think given the current circumstances, I would say the IMF and others are pretty much on track for the next couple of years, 1.4, 1.5% average, bearing in mind that some estimates indicate that load shedding alone shaves off between 1.5% and 2% of potential growth. So presumably that would mean, in the absence of load shedding, we could be growing at around about 3%, which is better. But, in the really long term, we need a growth rate of at least 5%, sustained for not just a couple of years, for a good decade or longer, to bring about the much needed narrowing inequality, job creation, reduction of poverty, broad-based economic development. And I think I always like to say to people, if I were to sit here or stand here or talk to you today and say that our current growth rate is the absolute best we can ever hope for, then that would be a depressing thing to say. To say that we are underperforming is not exactly a compliment, but it's less of an indictment on where we are. In other words, I think we are underperforming, but it's going to take some really firm structural changes and a bit of pain and suffering to bring about the required changes to embark upon a somewhat high economic growth rate.